Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Tyler Blackwell and I'm the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Curatorial Fellow at the Blaffer Art Museum. We're incredibly thrilled to welcome Paul Sepuya back. Paul Sepuya back to Houston to deliver a talk on the occasion of his exhibition next door at the museum, his first major solo museum survey. This show, which I hopefully most of you have seen, if you haven't, it's on view for just a few more weeks through March 14th. I wanted to be sure to acknowledge, we're very grateful for the support of the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center for the Arts for this program. And I'm also really excited to announce that the exhibition's catalog, which is also Paul's first museum monograph, which is co-published by the Camp St. Louis and Aperture, will also arrive here in Houston any day now. So please be sure to come back to the museum in the coming weeks to get your copy. Now on to a very brief bio of Mr. Sepuya here. Over the course of the last several years, Paul Sepuya's work has been exhibited and collected by a staggering number of galleries and museums across the world, including the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the MCA Chicago, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Getty Center, the Whitney Museum, and our very own Museum of Fine Arts Houston. He's currently acting associate professor of visual arts at UC San Diego, and very excitingly, he will be opening an exhibition of new work actually next month at Suzanne Villemetter Projects in Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Paul Sepuya.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this? This is crazy. It's really funny to be standing like on the side here. Yeah, thank you so much for having me to Houston. It's great. And it's been such a pleasure to kind of have a chance to see all of this work from seems like a long time in one place. Yeah, it's really special. Like there's a moment where some of these things that are in this show here and was at like in St. Louis just before this, it's like had just been in boxes for years, you know? So it's like save all of your prints in print file boxes because one day, 15 years later, someone might want to show them. So yeah, this has just been like a really great pleasure. I was thinking of just like doing a talk, you know, you kind of go through all of the steps of things. And I realized once I got here that I'd kind of put this together based off of like a recent talk I had to do for like art history people at UCLA, which made me really nervous. I was like, I don't, like talking in front of art historians like made me really nervous. But talking in front of like students, fellow artists, I wanted to actually go through this. I'm gonna try to go through a couple of things more briefly to open it up for questions, because you all have actually gotten a chance to spend more time with the show than I have. Like I came in October and I got to see the opening real quick, missed my second week of class at UCSD, and now I'm like just back for the second time. So for those of you who've spent time in the show or had things to think about, I'd rather have you able to like ask questions and us go from there. I hope that's okay. So this is the first time I've ever titled an artist talk also. So it's called A Conversation Around Pictures, and it's also the title for the show that's opening on March 14th in LA. And it kind of brings together a lot of things I have been thinking about. And maybe to illustrate some of that, I'm gonna start off by reading a couple of notes. So I have printed out here, sorry about that. It's like a stack of papers. I'm not gonna read all of this. But what it is I'm like, when it comes to writing about my work and thinking things, I kind of keep a running Google Doc of just things that I'm thinking about, excerpts from my notebook, research, things that I write down after conversations with friends, and it's sort of something that I kind of pull from. It helps me make sense of work that I'm doing. Another thing about my process is that I work sort of step by step, quite reflexively, intuitively, and often in the process of returning to editing and revising like the unresolved bits of whatever projects came before it. So where it comes to like making meaning and thinking things through is in a process of reflection rather than like sitting down, reading a bunch of books, mapping out a thesis and like executing pictures to illustrate that, which I think is the worst way to make artwork, no offense to people who work that way, but I can't do that. I'd rather let the process drive me, and so thinking, like reading, thinking, theory are ways I think of clarifying what has happened. Okay, so anyways, I'm gonna read a couple of things real quick. One is a note from Sabine Kribel. She's describing Victor Bergen's theory on photography. And she says, the primary suturing instance in photography, as Bergen argues, is the subject's identification with the camera position. That ego identification with the camera eye will oscillate between voyeurism and narcissism. That is, between a controlling gaze over the object represented and identification with that object. Bergen proposes a, quote, structural homology between the look of the photograph, between the look at the photograph and the look of the fetishist. Another note that I had, and this was after a conversation with my friend, photographer Aspen Mays. Aspen came to my studio and she was talking about what interested her is that in looking at the photographs, she never knew how to settle on what was the setup and what was the event. I got to thinking about if there was even a specific moment or an unfolding set of conditions or elements set into motion. And this is what led to the title of my most recent solo exhibition in what year is it? Oh God, it was March 2019, which was called The Conditions. So the definition of conditions are, as a noun, the factors or prevailing situation influencing the performance or the outcomes of a process, or a state of affairs that must exist or be brought about before something else is possible or permitted. And as a verb, condition means train or accustom someone or something to behave in a certain way or to accept certain circumstances, or to bring something into a desired state for use, or to set prior requirements on something before it can occur or be done. And then the last thing from here I want to read is actually a little bit of literature. Actually, I'm going to read two things, and then we'll get to looking at pictures. Okay. And this is a journal entry that my friend Ryan wrote in the summer of, I believe, 2011. He came to visit my studio in Harlem when I was doing a residency. And I asked him if I could quote this. Paul uses the phrase concentric circles in describing his interest in the diaries of Bloomsbury lesbians. Their lives and the ways in which their writings overlap fascinate him. I'm not too sure, but his summation that they're either gardening or about to kill themselves after a breakup makes them sound like a good read. Concentric circles are on my mind whenever I go up to Harlem to visit Paul in his studio. I picture, incorrectly, Venn diagrams with grade school blue and yellow circles and the muddy green oval they have in common. I think about the way lives intersect, because there, tacked up on the walls and scattered and stacked on the floor, are photographs of men and the occasional lady who I've seen in bars and on sidewalks for years, have met at one of Paul's dinner parties or worked under. There are portraits of friends, people I want to meet, and guys I'm just beginning to know. It's a bit like a social network mapped out on the wall. Let's see, I wanna skip to one more little part of that. But I say Venn diagram incorrectly because while writing this, I looked up concentric circles and discovered they are in fact circles that share the same center. They fit inside one another like a bullseye. This strikes me as more apt because more than a mere representation of Paul's social world, the accumulation and repetition of images of objects and people in the studio seem to have the power to collapse time in a funny way. The potted succulent and shriveled orange peel that sit on the window ledge are the same ones in the framed photograph that leans beside them. When my boots and shirt get cast aside, they end up slumped over a portrait that Paul took of me months before. While I take my pants off, the Beyoncé that we're listening to is the same Beyoncé that we danced to a few nights earlier. Paul asks me to recreate poses struck a week ago by someone I recognize but don't personally know. I realize I could listen to Beyoncé and talk about Beyoncé pantsless with Paul all day. So that's that. Anyways, okay, so let's get to actually looking at things. Okay, so yeah, I structured this. I never structured it, but I wanted to start off with the last talk I did with thing about looking at the pictures. And so this is a picture that's in the show, and this is one that I made in 2016 as part of my thesis at UCLA. And I swear I'm not going to just keep reading things, but I want to read a description that I wrote from this. It was an assignment given to me by one of my grad school advisors, Jim Welling. He just told me, just stop and look at the picture and write about it. So this is a small photograph, as those have seen in the exhibition, right? In the picture, a mirror sitting on top of a bench leans against the studio wall at a slight sideways angle so that the photographing subject, which is me, with the camera, is not visible. At the left of the mirror reflection, the leg of a tripod enters the reflected frame, along with a drapery of some cheap gold fabric. The same drapery extends to the non-reflected present space, and across the bench, and then behind the mirror, where it is reflected yet again between a print clipped to a second mirror leaning against the wall. The edge of a man's arm and shoe can be seen depicted in that print, which introduces yet another space into the picture. That space could be just off frame and within the same studio, or an altogether different place and time. Either way, the studio becomes a ground or the site that represents itself through its own reproduction, incorporating into itself various other sites through their reproductions brought into it. That's a lot of words, but the point is, everything that's happening in the pictures is happening in real space, and it's very important that every image, no matter how sort of complicated they might seem at first glance, eventually reveals its own making. I don't use Photoshop, I don't use any sort of manipulation. Every image that you see is a single capture. And so in works, and this is what I'm talking about for all the sort of like mirror studies, all this sort of like newer work, each one is a single image that kind of collapses both present and reflected space, and there's often a larger sort of loop between myself, my camera apparatus, the surface of the mirror, or in this case, which was sort of the jumping off point for the show that's gonna open next month, sort of another internal loop between my friend Yasser and his making of his own sort of like selfie in this space that I've set up. And it's kind of hard to see in the projection, but you'll notice there are these smudges on the mirror. They kind of get blown out in this, but on the screen, or if you were to see it in present, or you would have seen it in a lot of the works in the show, that mirror surface is not supposed to disappear into nothingness. It's not supposed to be, it's not supposed to disappear into sort of something used for an illusion, right? That I'm really interested in everything taking place in the studio in real space rather than a digital composition. So if you have a question about the titles for a lot of these recent works, what you're seeing in the parenthesis for the works that are with digital capture is just the file number assigned by the camera. So if someone's like super film camera nerdy, whatever tech, you would identify that this is made with a Canon 5 DSR camera, right? Other images, you would know they're made with the Panasonic Lumix, and each one is just sort of like assigned. For the ones that are made on film, it is the roll number and the frame number for that. But this is all just to say, all of the aspects of the image add up to revealing their own making. If we go back here, the leg of the tripod on the left-hand side is the leg of the tripod that's holding up the camera that I'm studying to make this picture. The space, that makes sense. We can get more into this, but I just wanted to start off by sort of slowing down and kind of looking at how the pictures are made. This image here, Between a Mirror and a Ground, kind of contains all of those things. We see this, in this one, we see pulled back the edges, beyond the edges of the mirror, that is the reflecting space, alongside which are some elements tacked to the wall on the left and the right that enter into the work in various other projects. In front, my figure standing, holding the camera that is making the image, is obscured by two prints that are from other works that are cut and reconfigured and taped onto the mirror's surface. And then here are some install views, just to get another sense. I put these in for when I'm not giving talks in the context of exhibitions, because I think it's important also to know that the photographs exist at a particular size and scale, which is very important to me, that the scale tends to do two different things in the works, which is either to reproduce what is on or in front of, or immediately in front of the surface of the mirror at a sort of a one-to-one scale, or it will present the camera and tripod apparatus as sort of a one-to-one. And again, I'll probably get more into this later. More install shots. Okay, so references, because we all gotta have references for things. And I kind of want to start off, I mean, this is my own work, but this kind of leads into references for a lot of sort of this current thinking. So this series Exposures from this project, sort of Dark Room, really comes off of me thinking about this sort of like relationship between the photographer's darkroom and the darkroom of sex clubs and bars. And the ways in which not only there's sort of this aesthetic overlap, but also a type of initial encounter or experience with a subject that is developed or develops in darkness or under these red and gold lights that then is transformed into an object, whether that be an object of artwork or an object in terms of the social relationships that is then navigated in the light, right? But for anyone who has a darkroom practice or you develop a primary sense of looking that anticipates how something will exist elsewhere. The viewer who comes into the gallery is not necessarily going to have that experience. You always have entangled with it sort of like two types of things. And I think the same way about the ways in which the history and sort of like contemporary and the future of sort of queer social experience relates to that. And I'll kind of get more into that later. That goes into, extends sort of from the portraits. But I just sort of want to lay these two things out. And then also that ties back into this text that I could read one more thing. I said I was gonna read that little bit of literature and I never did it. But it's been super important to me, and it's in this, this one issue sort of zine from 1926 called Fire, which includes the first sort of publicly acknowledged queer writing by a Black American author. And the thing that I really, really loved about that text is that the author, Richard Bruce Nugent, he writes this text in first person that, how do I say, whose subject position is defined by moving through these spaces, walking down alleyways, in and out of jazz clubs, into parties, and the recognition and the naming of names, and cruising bodies, and sort of a dream space. And I relate that very much to the photographic practice. And maybe I'll read a little excerpt of this, because it's really beautiful, but now I've mixed up all my papers. Sorry about this. Okay. And it's called Smoke, Lilies, and Jade. Okay, I'm just gonna read one little bit. Alex wondered more and more why he liked Adrian so. He liked many people, Wally, Zora, Clement, Gloria, Langston, John, Gwenny. Oh, many people, and they were friends, but Beauty, it was different. Once Alex had admired Beauty's strength, and Beauty's eyes had grown soft, and he had said, "I like you more than anyone, Dulce." Adrian always called him Dulce. And Alex had become confused. Was it that he was so susceptible to beauty that Alex liked Adrian so much? But no, he knew other people who were beautiful, Fania and Gloria, Monty and Bunny, but he was never confused before them. While beauty could make him believe in Buddha or imps, and no one else could do that. That is, no one but Melva, but he was in love with Melva, and that explained that. He would like Beauty to know Melva. They were both so perfect, such compliments. Yes, he would like Beauty to know Melva because he loved them both. There, he had thought it. And so there's, we can talk about all sort of like the formal overlaps. I love this image on the cover of there, this sort of like red and black. This is a portrait of Bruce Nugent by Carl Van Vechten. I'm just gonna throw Carl Van Vechten out there. We could talk about that a whole other time. But again, the one thing I wanna say about Van Vechten is I'm interested in the way he used photography as sort of like the way a spider lays in wait, right? He sort of sets up a stage that allows him to literally capture this world of Black writers and dancers and artists, and that's entwined with the entire history, I think, of photography as a medium and sort of like the studio itself. But yeah, there's also all the other troubling things about him. I'm also really interested in Virginia Woolf and Orlando. Literature and text, and particularly the negotiation of sort of the subject and then the resulting work is of interest, as well as this collaboration that Woolf does with her sister in transforming Vita Sackville West, who's the subject of the book, at the dissolution of their relationship, into the character of Orlando, which is then recreated in these pictures. So she and Vanessa transform Vita into Orlando through a series of photographs that accompany a fake biography. And so all of this kind of relates to the studio work project. Both Richard Bruce Nugent, Virginia Woolf, et cetera, kind of like lead into that, as well as sort of the history of this famous photograph of Truman Capote from 1948. And this kind of ties in when I'll sort of get to the zines, and I'll explain it a little bit more. But Capote is an important figure, especially this image, because he understood back in, even before this image, in the early 40s, the way in which the production, the staging, the production, and the dissemination of photographs was important to creating a space of seduction, and the ways in which that image allowed him to cross disciplines. And I can get more into that, but just want to throw this out there. This is sort of like a context of in like an advertisement at the time. I mean, I guess one thing I should say is, like, in 1948, authors did not have pictures on their books, right? And this is his first book, and he was the original sort of like Instagram person who just loaded a lot of content of themselves before their book or their album, whatever came out, right? So he was just like famous for having been like hanging around like at the Vermont Studio Center or like with other famous people. And he was just like young and precocious, and this was the culmination of a campaign of self-promotion meant to seduce, and it places him later on in this sort of intersection of texts between Gore Vidal, Christopher Isherwood, all these other people. So anyways, I put that out there because it's important in relationship to, I think, thinking about like social, the use of portraiture in terms of the development of social media, particularly from 2005 onward. This Jean Weisinger image is called Seeing Myself Through Alice Walker's Eyes. And again, when I'm talking about this, my interest in the collapsing of different genres, Weisinger did a project of photographing queer women in the 1970s, or she would say lesbian and bisexual women. And Alice Walker is one of the people she approached, and she writes really beautifully about this. She was trying to make a document of a community that had not been documented before and was quite unsure of this project she set out to do. And so she says when she asked Alice Walker, Alice said, I want to photograph you as well. And she describes the kind of like exchange in that as being affirming in a way that allowed her to move forward. And so we don't think about, I mean, if anyone hasn't read Alice Walker's The Same River Twice, it's like one of the best books on writing and art making. I would definitely recommend it. But we don't think of Alice Walker's impact in terms of a really important historical project, like Jean Weisinger's. Anyways, more Van Vechten. I could go on and on about these references, but I just want to throw this out there thinking about staging. It's sort of like cheap, funny, like beautiful staging that often serves as an excuse, that serves as the setup alongside the event. George Platt lines, the use of sort of like surrealism, lighting, whatever, the ways in which photographers have always used sort of like the tricks of artiness to disguise, you know, otherwise just sexy pictures of sexy men. Robert Mapplethorpe, what do we do about Mapplethorpe? I don't know, throwing it out there. Because Rotimi Fani-Coyote did it way better. I like that, I like thinking about contemporaries who were able to speak back and who are now finding the recognition that they so often deserved. You know, this is one of the people that Mapplethorpe took a lot of ideas from. They were in dialogue with each other. And I think this image so beautifully sums up Fani-Coyote's position. And Larry Rivers, a very troubling painter, but when we talk about his work, I'm interested in the ways in which artwork and the production of artwork can register on two levels, and one is its ability to disclose gossip. Gossip being the types of information that are not typically sanctioned by strict disciplines. And in this sense, this painting, The Studio, this being a detail of that, in the way in which it discloses an aspect of his affair with Frank O'Hara. On the left, we have Rivers and O'Hara, and this is sort of like at a moment in which they're both these sort of very public figures and public positions, and anyways, gossip, love gossip. And Lyle Ashton Harris is a very important influence and reference in the ways in which his work is constantly open to revision. One of the things I think about is that as an artist, all of the work that is made, it doesn't matter if it was made this week, a year ago, 10 years ago, is always open for revisiting and revision. And the way he incorporates these layers of his own work, of things pulled from visual culture, from pop culture, et cetera, kind of continues to get reworked into these very meaningful collages and installations. Okay, so that's all the background. I'm gonna take a sip. Okay, said I was gonna go fast. I need to go faster. Portrait, circulation, accumulation. Okay, a little bit of background. So yeah, there's like a table out there with all the like old zines and stuff I did. And so when I'm also talking about this like why am I so interested in like Truman Capote, right? So my work, and especially those portraits that are along the wall, the small ones, that's the stuff that, like, this is the first time I've ever shown that work, right? It circulated for years from 2005 to about 2010 only through zines. It was like, just like lived in queer zines, right? But magazine was sort of like the most notorious one. And this is the point at which I realized, because I approached the desire to make portraits from a desire or a belief that photography offered sort of like a very precise and assuring way to make a record of those people around me, right? Basically, I picked up my camera after I graduated from undergrad, and I finally had a group of like gay friends kind of started forming in Brooklyn, and I was like, oh my God, how do I make sense of all this? And I thought, if I sit everyone down and I make portraits of them, like, I'm gonna know who these people are. But I quickly realized that through these, like all of this that's happening in the way that the images were circulating, the work circulated faster than I or we could sort of make sense of the images in front of us. I hope that makes sense. At the same time, it's like Friendster is just starting, like MySpace is kind of like getting its legs out there, and the images kind of became notorious in a way we kind of had not anticipated. And my idea that like the photograph itself would kind of like nail down like an aspect or an understanding of a friendship or a relationship was replaced with like me actually thinking that the work itself was what are the unintended consequences of the making of portraiture. Yeah, it was like, you know, and also I have to say I don't photograph models, I don't photograph like strangers. I was really interested in making portraits of friends, and so it's like at the time I wouldn't know that like I would have gotten like one of those online ordination things and like married her like a couple months ago. You know, it's like these are like my closest best friends that it's kind of crazy to sort of see like there's new portraits with Darren in this show that's coming up. At the time, I was really just trying to make sense of kind of like the social landscape. And yeah, so this is kind of the work that I was doing at the beginning, and it was made, I'm using my RZ, my Mia RZ 6.7, got like my cheap, like used camera store, mono head for a little fill flash, you know, like all of the aspects of the technology, I think in its ability to deliver like a very sort of crisp document in the form of an image, like that sort of slowed down process, I think is what leads photography to present that illusion of stability, of like making a photograph allows a fiction of stability amidst like these amidst unstable like fields, right? And also we all know all of the problems like in terms of the way photography creates subjects or subjects of political or social control, domination, like whatever. But on my level, like it really was pretty innocuous. It's like, I'm just thinking about just like social media or something. I don't know. Everything seems like way more serious sometimes, like in retrospect. But I was having a good time. And so the work then moved into the space of the studio. And so I was making all of those initial portraits at my own home or the homes of friends. And I, you know, kind of had the relationship to photographs as coming right out of school. Like I had, you know, I would shoot my film, I would get it processed, I'd go to the dark room, I'd set up for a little bit, everything would close down, it goes under a box, stays under my bed in Brooklyn, and then I wait until something happens, or I make a zine. I had access to a studio for the first time in 2010, and suddenly what happened was I realized what could happen when everything could sort of like, when everything could remain consistently in the present. And this sort of like idea of studio time. And so I had a residency, and this is the one that my friend Ryan writes about in Harlem, where for a year I had this space up at the Studio Museum, and I didn't know what to do. I was like, oh my God, I've like applied and tried to get into residencies, and I finally quit my job, and now what am I doing? I'm in this space, and so I just was like, okay, friends, come on by, like, you know, and it was an empty space, and what I didn't really even make sense of what the project itself was until afterwards, but it became a process of making, remaking, and accumulation. So the space became filled with people, with the things that were left behind, and a lot of me just being there by myself and bored and photographing the objects that were there. And so, yeah, this is like one of those orange peels, you know. That like book there is the 1995 Patricia Morris wrote biography of Mapplethorpe that a friend found in a bookstore. And the picture that's on top of it, underneath the little succulent, was a photograph that I found stuck inside of it with like a love letter dedication on the back from like one guy to another in Fire Island, the same year the book came out. And I was really interested in thinking about like how is it and why is it that this book ended up at the, you know, the dollar section of the Strand on Broadway in New York City, and it's, you know, in the context of 1995, like it could be a breakup or it could be death. You know, we don't know. Anyways, there's all of these kind of like loops and cycles of time that I'm thinking about in the work. And we'll go through some of this stuff from the Studio Museum. Also, so that crate of material, and then that one table that kind of has a lot of these photographs in there, that comes from the Studio Museum. The project, I realized at its end was, yeah, there's these photographs that I made, but between what's in that crate and a lot of the stuff you can't even really see in there because stuff's like in manila envelopes and folders and things like that, amidst the ones that are like on the table for you to see, is just all of the test prints, the outtakes, the like notes, the books that I was reading during that year up there. And the work, so the work itself is just, every time I go back in there, is just opening it up and like recontextualizing it. Because like I said, you know, the subjects return over time, and so every time I go back to these sort of developing archives, they are re-informed by whatever's happening contemporaneously. And this leads to that idea of the collage of compressed tenses, which I borrow from Brian O'Doherty in his essay Studio and Cube on the relationship between where art is made and where it's displayed. And you know, so this again is like these ideas of time and sort of the ways things are condensed and then sort of like expand back out again come into the work. So after that residency, I didn't have a studio for the next few years, and so I was trying to find a way to make work at the same time that a lot of the photo labs and darkrooms in New York at the time were getting either super pricey or closing down. And so I just went to Staples and I got a $99 color laser printer and I stuck it under my bed, and I just also was just like, I'm just gonna get a digital camera or use my phone. And I just started printing, like shooting much more loosely and just printing everything out and thinking that, okay, I can return to some of those methods that I developed making zines, where it's like, you know, the quick laser print, like the ways in which editing and sequencing and kind of accident can happen. And I started, you know, so for example, like this is a small bundle of papers that I might have organized around a subject, and I would have just carried that around in my tote bag. And at the time, my friend Brendan Fernandez had been out of the country, and so I had access to his, he let me sublet his studio for a month, and then I would sort of take them apart and photograph them, and these became works in themselves. Oh, sorry about that. Or I would photograph these elements just sort of on my desktop on any given sort of day. What this really allowed me to do, oh, that gets to another fun part. What that allowed me to do was really think about layering, or how do I say? Oh, I'll just sort of jump ahead. Anyway, this is all about sort of like time and compression. Another thing that started happening, I made this funny project and I'd never shown this one before, is people started telling me that my stuff was floating around on Tumblr, and I was like, oh, this is really exciting. And again, this idea of sort of like accident, I've only shown this work maybe once in a show that Nayland Blake curated at ICA Philadelphia. I scoured, like, there was like a year when I didn't know what I was doing, so I just scoured my past work on Tumblr and I just took screen grabs of everything. I have like thousands of pictures. And I called it kind of like accidental curation because I loved the ways in which like my work just like appeared in the mix of whatever someone else had kind of done. And so I just have them, it's like the name of the Tumblr and the subject. So like in the middle here, we have my 2005 portrait of Rafi. We have my 2011 portrait of Fitzroy, and we have like a 2008 portrait of Jay. But again, this is this idea again of like this collage of compressed tenses, which then leads into, this is kind of like the stage on the way towards the mirror studies. Because it kind of comes about, everything is like by bits and pieces moving forward. So I've been thinking about this return to the methods of the zines, right? The being sort of let loose from the studio and working through just these bundles of loose papers. And I eventually, after I was in New York for 14 years, I was like, I need to go back to grad school. And I was like, I wanted to go back to California after having left so much longer before. And I had a studio again when I got to UCLA. But I also had boxes and like banker's boxes of just like printouts, unresolved material. None of this stuff had been finalized, right? And so this is just like a snapshot. I don't even know if it's a real work, but it's one of the things that was on the way to the mirror. So one of the things that had happened at going back to the studio museum, right, is that the studio itself became like I don't know what that is doing. I swear I'm not like smacking myself. That the studio became this recurring backdrop to all of the images, and it would change at a rate that was slow, that was more slow, but not like imperceptible in relation to the figures, the portraits that were being made in it, if that makes sense. And I don't know why I apologize that I didn't put more of the portraits from the Studio Museum in here, but I wanted that idea of this sort of recurring space, right? And I also really wanted to think about like incorporating that in a way in which I always had to be present in the image. So like the way that the work started really, and maybe I'll just jump ahead to this image, was I went to Home Depot and I just got a bunch of mirrors and put them in the back of my car, and I filled my studio with them, and I began a way of trying to resolve all of this loose material by just covering these surfaces and rephotographing it, that then I could sort of find connections and then sort of like put them away. But I like the fact, and this is kind of gets to this idea of double enclosure, which I used as the title of a show about a year or two ago in Amsterdam, that in the making of these images, on the mirror's surface, I'm always a part of the composition. I'm always in the image. I can't help but see myself as I'm working. And at that moment, when I decide to make the picture, I can either set the camera up on a tripod and I can press the shutter, or I could set it on a timer on the tripod and walk away and not be in the image, but I feel that there's some sort of echo, or I can sort of remain present. So in here, we can see the edge of my arm as I'm photographing myself. And they were sort of very loose, but they became more formalized. And so this project, these studies, were a way of like working through those 4 or 5 years of material after this abrupt leave from New York. And oftentimes they were made in conversation with the subjects. This work here, Study for Roses at Night, for 4K, which stands for Kevin, was made with an older man in Palm Springs who had been buying my zines since I first started making them, and we had kind of developed like just a letter writing correspondence. And when I came back to LA, I drove out to the desert and we met, and we sort of talked about how we started collecting, and he let me take some images in his home, and there's a little image there of a man in a red shirt kind of under the shadow, and that's an image of his partner who had passed away, which was the collection that he was building was in memory of him. So this one became more sort of was happening in the moment, but it includes these prior elements that I'd kind of like carried with me, and that kind of like turned over into another type of kind of collage. And this goes back to thinking about the ways in which material just sort of overlaid when I first had access to the studio. So, but maybe one way to explain the jump, which I should have had more images to explain, is that the fragmentation in these pictures was, again, just due to the fact that I was using this laser printer, right? So everything is printed out 8.5 by 11. Even if I'm printing larger images, things are kind of getting chopped up, right? And I wanted to find another type of fragmentation that was more accountable to me and to my hand and to choices that I was making. So I began cutting and tearing and layering myself. So this also includes some of my own images, these fragments of red, which are just taken from my iPhone, some images that are made in my studio, some things that are printed out, reference notes. So this is kind of, again, this idea of this, the way in which time works. And then the curtain. So the mirror is also a backdrop. The studio, again, once I had kind of worked through those initial studies of the archive material, I began making portraits in the studio again, right? And I became really interested in the backdrop for a couple of reasons. The surface of the mirror in images like these and these are actually covered with fingerprints and smudges. You can't see them though, because the white wall completely obliterates them, right? I quickly realized well, I didn't quickly realize, it was through accident, because everything that happens is sort of like through accident and observation, boredom, a lot of boredom in the studio, is I became really interested in this fact of two things. By setting up a curtain or a backdrop in my studio in which to photograph people in front of, I was also creating a space that was meant not to be seen, right? This starts extending these ideas of the darkroom, but also in the initial studies that I was making where the camera or the tripod overlapped with a smudge, it was then visible because the camera and tripod are black. And then also it would happen with my own body. And I began thinking about sort of like a reversal of the priorities of photography. And again, I really wish this, like the actual image versus its projection here is so different, because where those curtains are, there is like a really rich depth of like smudges and traces. And so with, let me just jump back because I could just keep, because you've seen these. Okay, I began really thinking about working in that space, right? And moving the subject, or at times the camera, into that space. And so, and what also happens is that let's jump ahead, and this is, oh gosh, I'm sorry it's so dark. This is the first image where I was attempting to photograph the surface of the mirror itself. And using these black and brown velvets, these materials that photography just has kind of like inherited since its inception in the studio, in really trying to figure out what could be done with that. Because I guess another way to say it is there was this sort of latency on that mirror's surface. I should also mention, I forgot to say, I don't clean the surface of the mirror. And I didn't clean the surface of the mirror because I didn't want it to be a non-space, right? I wanted it to reveal itself, right? And so the accident of how it became revealed was through darkness, through blackness, right? And thinking about how, if you go to the beginnings of photography, how blackness is entwined and essential for the production of images. That there's a type of latency that is otherwise like obliterated when against the backdrop of whiteness, of white walls. And so where the Darkroom project really comes in is just like kind of, there's just so much to think about this. And I began moving into that space using both myself, my camera, and that material in order to reveal its surface. People often thought this was sort of like smoke or some other kind of like effect, but it's just the smudges that are left after the making of portraits, or my hands working and arranging kind of collage and things on its surface. And then this sort of opened up into like a much more playful aspect. A friend came to my studio and he didn't understand, like, I was showing him this and he's like, I don't know how you did this. And I was like, oh, well, I'll just show you. And then he was like, I want to be in one. And I was like, no, it's just me. And so I was like, okay, and this isn't the image, but I took one where he's behind me kind of pulling back the curtain. And I was like, oh my God, it's like, okay, we've got the dark room. Because in order to make these, I was constructing a dark cloth over the mirror and putting the camera inside and then pulling back the curtain enough to let light through. And so I was like, oh, this is great. This is just like a gay darkroom back of club situation. And so then the compositions on that, I was like, okay, I can really entwine kind of like an origin point for photography, kind of like flipping the priorities of the hierarchies of light, of clarity, of lucidity, of darkness, of blackness, of what blackness itself can reveal in terms of image making. And it's just been like really fun from there. And so, yeah, we have this is where the Darkroom project comes from. Also want to point in is there are times when I introduce a second camera, I want to say, because it's really important, that whenever there's another subject in my images that's making a photograph, it's not staged, that they are also photographers and they are making their own images. I don't think I include much about that in this presentation, but that became the subject of the Whitney, the project I did at the Whitney Museum, which was a presentation of the photographs made by, for example, rather than showing my image, there was a triptych of Giancarlo's images, not the one necessarily corresponding to this, but at a point in which he turns and photographs everything else in the studio, the makeshift studio space besides me. Because my camera and my presence had kind of been reinforced in all these images, I felt it kind of important, and I wanted to think about a way in which to introduce a second point perspective. And now we're just sort of getting to some more recent work. And these are things, like these ones you've seen. Oh, this is some for the new show that's coming up. I'm interested in this like internal loops. I can talk more about this if someone's curious, but I want to just kind of get to the end so I can open it up to conversations and questions. Because also it's like when you're showing your most recent stuff, it's like it's not resolved. So I don't know what to tell you about it for like these ones. And then maybe we'll end with, oh yeah, I forgot, I put in some outtakes. So, because I thought it would be really fun. So I don't even know what these are. These are just like random sort of like things. Maybe I'll make them, I don't know. This one, actually this one is a picture that's going to be in the show. But again, this is all about like, I'm not even sure where the difference between the setup and the event is. This new show has a lot of like iPhone pictures. There's a lot of iPhones in them. And it's like, I don't know if it's gonna be really embarrassing or cheesy, but it's like, I like that. I mean, it's really hard to see in there, but within these, like what Silas is holding up, because it's pointed towards the mirror surface, it actually reveals the entire studio in a way. So and oftentimes like, Jacob, he's a musician, but he also makes these really interesting kind of like in-camera digital manipulation things. So this, like I like the way that the work itself has this sort of loop, like kind of closed circuit, but the iPhones, the images, those themselves kind of point towards like another type of circulation that leaves the gallery walls. So here we have just like, this is just like the newest stuff. And who knows? Yeah. Outtakes. I think all these ended up being outtakes. Oh, this one's gonna be in the show. This one's like the show card. Yeah. And that's it. Okay, I hope I didn't go like overtime or bore you or anything, but just ask anything, because I'll just blab on forever otherwise. And I know there's so many things I wanted to get to, but I didn't get to.
I'm teaching a class this semester where I asked the students to do exhibition reviews, and a lot of them wrote on your show, and one of the
Whoa.
things that, so I have like 20 exhibition reviews.
Oh my God. That's really cool.
And I asked these questions so that I can sort of like report back to them.
Uh-huh.
Some of them got stuck on your use of nudity.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly it's a strategy. So I would just love to hear you talk more about like your engagement with the body, but specifically the naked body, and like how you like conceptualize that or philosophize that.
Oh. Okay, it's just about being honest. I mean, okay, so I started making pictures when I was a teenager, and I was just like obsessed with like, okay, on the one hand, I wanted to be like David LaChapelle, and I really just wanted to be like photographing Lil' Kim for the cover of Vibe magazine. And then on the other hand, I was just like scouring like newsstands in Hollywood, and like and also the early internet, and I was just really into the way in which before you could like go to a search engine, and I'm dating myself, in the mid-90s, you couldn't just, like when you tried to find gay, like I would go to the newsstand to find like gay things, right? And I might find art, and I might find just like porn, I might like find, you know, it's all in how it was used, right? And there was like no hierarchy. And so from the beginning, like my draw to making images is, to be honest, one that has an erotic component to it, right? And so I realized when I went to undergrad, like I took wonderful courses and I loved everything, right? But I realized, and I'm not showing any of that work that I made then, but I realized that I was making images of people that I was trying to like literally just like pile on a little bit of a thing from every interesting class I took to disguise the fact that I really just wanted to take pictures of people that I knew and wanted to get to know, and that there was an erotic aspect of looking. So at the end, I was just like having a total crisis, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I was like, okay, let me just sit everyone down, and we're gonna like everyone get as nude, naked, whatever, as you feel comfortable, and let's take our portraits. And so from those earliest ones, I wanted to make the images, because it was also an aspect of like the formation of like, I'll say gay, but also I have to say that not everyone in the work is queer, and you can't identify the sexual orientation or the gender identity of anyone through the work. So, but at the time, we just were saying gay, right? Okay, so that in the formation of this gay space, like every sort of like every beginning of a relationship in its broadest sense could be creative, it could be romantic, it could be erotic, it could be just sort of like intellectual, right? But I wanted to have a base level of like, I want to be honest that like at its core, the coming together of it all is through an aspect of sexual or erotic charge. And so I photographed everyone as if we could have been or were or could possibly be lovers. And so we have both platonic and erotic friendships and relationships. I've photographed this exact same way. And so I've just wanted to keep that honest. And as I've gotten to the newer work, especially with like the darkroom projects and stuff, because part of going back to grad school was wanting to sort of be like, how can I get like pictures like this in a show about the history of photography, right? Because oftentimes there'll be like a show about like blackness and photography or queer, right? But then when you go to a show that's like the history of photography, it's just like, I don't know, it's just like some landed gentry from like the 1860s, just like fiddling with their things, right? But I'm like, okay, photography, I could go on and on about this, but like photography is a technology, and it's like the result of like a productive type of a desire, right? And I think about, oh God, there's like, who is those images? I'm bad on my like photo history right now. What's his name who photographed that like bust, that like classical Greek bust over and over and over again? Does anyone know it? Like every photo museum has this thing. It's like from the 1840s or whatever. Anyways, it's like the gayest thing ever, right? But when you read art history texts, it's just kind of like, okay, and then there's all these delicate light studies of like trying to make a picture a certain way. But I'm like, if you were to read a book in the 19th century and like a character were to have that bust in the entrance to their house, that just says they're gay, right? So I'm just like, why do people point their cameras at certain things? Why is it that the history of photography is not also entangled with like history of desire, right? So anyways, I was like, I don't want to like hide the nudity. I don't want to like, I don't know, it's just like in pictures like these, I just want you to be able to think about like that photography and desire and like the requirement that black be a part of the image be like completely and like from here on out inseparable. So anyways, there was like a show on like the history of photography at the Getty, and I was like, oh my God, they put my picture in it? Like at the center, I was like, yes! It was like just a bunch of like old dead people. Like some lovely work, right? But I was like, oh wow, now there's like this black ass picture right in the center. So anyways, if they got stuck up on nudity, I hope it was like useful to think about. Okay. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for sharing, and it's been so great to have your work for so long to share, especially with students. And one class and I were talking about the smudges on the mirrors, and I was giving my interpretation of it, and I was just wondering if you thought that this was okay to have an interpretation. I was thinking that the smudges were meaning that nobody can look into a clean mirror. All weighed down by society and culture and what our culture and what our history has like told us that we're supposed to look like or we don't look like or what, you know, and I was just wondering if that those smudges were about like the fact that there's no clean mirrors, that we're all weighted down by the history of aesthetics.
I hadn't thought that, but I love it. I think it's true, right? It's like, did everyone hear what she said? Yeah, I love that interpretation. Like, I'm really open to that, and I love being able to, like, getting the feedback of how people are seeing things. Like, there's things that I intend, and then there's things that like other people bring to the work. And this is also part of that idea of like, and I didn't get to this, but like work coming back into the studio. Part of when I talk about like all work is open to revision and reworking, part of that is about like you make work as an artist, you may have intended one thing, goes out into the world, and then it's transformed, and then it comes back, and how does it then re-inform you as an artist? And I'm super interested in that. But the smudges were complete, it was like a practical thing, because I didn't want people to think that I was making digital constructions. I was like, look, it's actually a mirror. Like, you might catch a smudge. And then I was like, wait, but what's the only way you can see the smudge? And then I was like, then I did a little reading and conceptualizing. And then I was like, okay, I can like get to this other thing. But yeah, it's also for a long time, and it's like crazy now to think that I'm always just like blown away that people want to put these like nude pictures in shows or whatever. But you know, when work started really getting shown in galleries at the beginning, there was a resistance to the figure, to portraits. Like, it was much more sort of conservative space. And so I also, with the smudges, was thinking whether or not I or another body is represented in a reflection, our trace is still there. And that's why the latency was so important, because that black curtain or my body could reveal all of these layers of me and my friends and the work that we're doing, kind of like another way. Yeah, it also goes back to photography. Indexicality, you know, it's like the trace, all that stuff. It's the only indexical thing, and it's destroyed against the reflection of white walls. I thought that was interesting. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, okay, 1, 2. Yeah.
Speaking of layering, because you talked a lot about, especially the work where you started.
Oh yeah, let's go to that.
Kind of collaging or cutting and all of these
Like
layers,
these?
Kind of palimpsest that then we get as a flattened
Mm-hmm.
image. And I was kind of curious. You talked so beautifully about kind of photographic desire.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if you also feel a sense of nostalgia.
Oh God,
in your
yeah.
practice, and how you. I mean, I certainly feel that in hearing you talk about how these things, you know, sitting under your bed then become your practice again, and also the people themselves
Mm-hmm.
and the way that you're experiencing them as you rework pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, just to let you continue speaking about that kind of nostalgic desire.
Yeah.
So activating through photographs. That's so beautiful.
It's really crazy. And yeah, also something that I hadn't anticipated. Yeah, so there is a project that, let me see, do I have like this, you can sort of see 3 of them. There's these bound books. So starting in 2013, the way that I realized I could kind of like finally resolve these is once I've like fuddled around with them and I've rearranged them for a long time, I just like binder clip them and I send them to this woman, Corinna, in Brooklyn, and she binds them into these hardcover volumes. And so they become, like, I wanted them to be, and like in an installation like this, like they're open to a page, they're not available for people to really flip through, and they're not editioned. It's not like I'm making books out of them. But okay, so to go back to this whole like literature thing, there's an interview with Christopher Isherwood in the Paris Review in 1972, and like Christopher Isherwood, like, you know, if you've read like if you've seen like Cabaret, you know, it's like he was, you know, he had this whole series of diaries and journals from his years in Berlin and, you know, all this stuff. And his practice as a writer was continuously revisiting these, right? So by the time 1972 comes around, and it's like 4 years after he's written down They're on a Visit, which is another really important book for me, it's like in this interview he's talking about what it meant to have to go back to those sources, but at that time they'd already been like finalized and institutionalized. And I forget exactly where has his papers, but I was like, oh, like writers know what to do. And I started thinking about like other people that I know. I was like, wait, there's like living writers just like find a spot and they send their papers off, right? And I was like, otherwise I feel like I'd just be a hoarder of things. Also cutting up and rephotographing helps me throw things out. But I've started binding them. There's like 6 already. There's another 6 that are gonna be done for a show in like a year and a half. And they're incredibly nostalgic. But part of the process with that is I'm trying to go back and index them before I forget what's in them. Because they might have fragments of my work in them. They might have just like things that are not work, but just like iPhone snapshots. They might have things that I had as research, and I'm indexing them using, oh gosh, I'm indexing them using the method that Virginia Woolf used to create an index for the biography of Orlando, which is not a biography, but she creates an index. But you can cross-reference that index with the letters and the texts written by the real life subjects who get transformed. So in a sorry, I could go, there's like a million things that can spiral off when you ask me a question, but that's also important to me because a lot of the subjects of the work are artists in their own right, and I like that there's this intersection that happens that someone in the future might be able to find. So yeah, I'm terribly nostalgic. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not a chronological archive then?
It's not,
Okay,
no,
so
yeah.
that kind of formulates also this network kind of theory.
Yeah, like some stuff is new, some stuff, like I might have things that I never finished like from 8 years ago, and I'm like, oh, where'd that, okay, there's that box, like, and it gets worked into new stuff, you know, like it's not chronological, it's just sort of time-stamped by when it's bound. Yeah, yeah. There was a question there.
Yeah, I wanted to, there isn't like a fixed answer for this question, but in seeing the iPhone now make its way into work, and the iPhone being this conduit for a selfie culture where we're creating self-portraiture that's often designed towards perfection, how do you see that kind of, I guess maybe in conflict with or in conversation with your portraiture that obviously doesn't come from a place of perfection or ideal?
I have not thought about that. Yeah, because what I was thinking about was a different type of circulation with the image. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to think about this in terms of like well, I wonder, so because there's like 2 different types of things that can happen with, that I find that's like different from the making of like a selfie with the iPhone and then the setup that's constructed with the other cameras that I'm using. There's something that happens like in the making of the work behind the, let's say just like the main cameras, right? Where you're looking, oh gosh, how do I describe this? There's almost sort of like a disassociation that's happening, and I can't fully really be in both places at once, and so I'm kind of like not really present for myself because I'm so much focusing on like the composition of an image, and then it's sort of later on is kind of like finding what's happening. I think there's something that's different that happens with this selfie. That's the reason why I became really interested in it, because the subject is like more in like a different kind of a loop between like the way that they're, you know, because I'm looking through one camera composing an image based on like something that I'm not yet seeing, but the iPhone has like a moving screen, right? If that makes sense. There's like, what is it called? It's a scanning screen. Actually, like William E. Jones described this. He was like, okay, the DSLR itself is sort of like a capturing screen. It's like but the iPhone is a scanning screen. It's constantly moving, and so I just find that the subjects move in a different way. I actually don't even like really like necessarily ask like where their images are. I don't know like how much they're trying to be perfect or whatever. I'm interested in how they're used. I like when people like want to post them, or they become part of people's like Grindr profiles or like other things. But yeah, I hadn't thought about like ideas of perfection. I'm thinking about like concentration and like use. I hope I kind of got to that.
I started off with no fixed answer. So
Okay, cool. Yeah.
I have a question about the Studio March 11 image.
Uh-huh.
When you're describing it, it seemed like the book and the image were had like a very tight relation to each other. I just wanted to know if there was any calculation and you not
Yeah, so somewhere there's probably pictures from like all angles of this, you know, so like something like this would have just been, I just had these birch doors that I propped up on IKEA stands, and those just were tables moving around. And if like friends weren't over, like 99% of the time in the studio, it's just me looking at things, kind of like the best arrangements came from things moving around in the moment of making stuff, and then afterwards, me just looking and making a lot of observational photographs. So in terms of not showing the other side of the photograph with the letter or the spine of the book is probably an editing decision rather than what was shot, because somewhere in that box is probably like a test print of something that shows it. But in terms of editing, I think if I were to sort of like reverse engineer it, probably points to this idea that I'm interested in aspects of recognition. So if you were in my studio or you know me, you've seen that book, you know, like, so that's something that I'm thinking about. The orange peel, those entered into the space as initially a gift from my friend Jacqueline Gurevich. She's a painter in New York, and I was working for her for a while, helping her with her archives, and I would go and have lunch at her loft, and she would always like give me some like fruit, and then I'd like go up to Harlem, and then I'd give it to my friends. And and it was also an accent, because the earlier work was all made in my home with like, you wouldn't be able to tell, but these were all made at like, 8 or 9 at night after we've got off of our jobs, and I have like controlled lighting. There was no element of time in them, right? They weren't sort of like environmental portraits in a larger sense, right? So when I came into the studio for the first time, I was working with natural light and in a much more loose way, and so an element of time came in because there was this sort of like accumulation of material and objects. So the orange peels were really wonderful because I just left a few there once, and they just they didn't mold or like rot, they just sort of changed color and dried up. And they were like a nice little nod to the still life. And so they introduced a second loop of time into them. One, the studio is constantly kind of like accumulating, letting go things, reintroducing things. And then the orange peels and then the succulents introduced another kind of continuous time that you could string together, because over the project, that little plant and some other ones grow little flowers, and the flower blooms, and then it dies, and then just there's the little stalk. You start to see the same oranges over and over again, in the same way in which later on, and this is what sort of started to inform this work, is initially my idea was that, this material would kind of like cycle through and then move from the surface of the mirror to the surface of the wall and then out again. And that if you were to, you could recreate in chronological order by which fragments pick up from the next, the whole project. I apologize, I don't have a sequence to illustrate that, but that's what the orange peels introduced. And they still come in. There's one in that one. Yeah. Yeah, welcome.
Hi, I was wondering if you could possibly talk about the positioning of the bodies or the posture that the bodies adopt in some of the portraits.
Some of the newer ones?
Yeah, the mirror.
Oh, okay.
I just noticed that in some of like the earlier ones, when the whole body is shown, it may be in more of like a compressed or hunched over stance, whereas in some of the work like this, it's like a full body, and they're kind of in like a more naturalistic stance. So I was just wondering if that is just like the position that the body just adopted naturally.
Okay, so the question is about the positioning of the body in the images and compositions. So, well, these ones aren't, you're asking specifically the mirror portraits. Okay, so.
For example, like that one.
So like this one was in order to get as much as myself in the frame as I could. So yeah, that's also a funny thing with these, is like there's only so much sort of like posturing I can do, and the majority of it is like what I need to do to actually get the picture made. So yeah, these ones were actually incredibly like painful to do. After a while, I was just like, oh man, I need to like do some stretching or something. images, I mean, like these ones are just sort of like very kind of casual. Malik and I are just sitting on a bench on the other side of this, or I actually think we're on opposite sides of the curtain. Images like these, the composition is just based on like how would like a threesome with a camera work, right? And I'm really interested in like seeing how much of like bodies can fit in these. Like this one, there was a specific instruction I gave to Victor. I was like, I'm gonna be photographing myself. I want you to restrain me. I was like, I don't want to be able to see what I'm doing. And yeah, this is super dark. You can't really, everything kind of fades away, but this one's in the show so you can see it. In one like this, it's like, I don't know, I think I was just sitting on the ground and Giancarlo was just like sitting on a chair next to me. And it's just like, it wasn't really directed in a sense. But there are works where I am specifically thinking, like I'm laying out a composition ahead of time. This one with Vishal is one of those. I was really interested in, like I had like an image like this in my head and I just was like, okay, can we just like create it? This one with Yasser is also one that was, I wanted kind of like an image of him looking at himself below the curtain, so it was sort of meant to be full scale. There are some like these here, I was really interested in kind of where, like which body becomes the support, which body becomes the subject of the image. But it was like, I wasn't like, roll on the floor, but it was like really great. And then this one, in terms of composition, was one that I had kind of really like thought out. I wanted to create like sort of a seated nude that was looking at its own reflection in a space that cannot be seen, and in the possible confusion of how many bodies are back there. So sometimes there's like something kind of like set up. Oftentimes it just like extends from what position the body takes in making a picture. And oftentimes you do find like when you're making a picture, we don't even think about how we hunch over and do things. And so that's why it kind of tends to look like that. Yeah.
On the mirror study images, do you have a deeper meaning behind images of like the subject and the mirror itself?
Like these ones, these mirrors, or
The ones that you have the camera and you have the hands over them,
this one?
like similar like those, like down.
A deeper the meaning, I think there's several things that I like sort of set out to try to do with, like initially with the project, which was thinking about the space created of the dark room space, the dark cloth space, and I was just sort of like pushing it. And I was just like seeing how far it could go, and as well, I was kind of like building a lot of them off of kind of like imagined interactions, but I didn't have like a deeper meaning in terms of like a poetic meaning, right? I was, across all of them, like I wouldn't say like any single image is sort of like, I could sum one up this way and one another way, but across all of them, I'm thinking about, okay, what types of interactions happen in the space behind the curtain, in the space that is necessarily created by another space that's meant to be seen? What sorts of interactions would I have with these friends? And then also, again, like I wish we could see it in these projections, is like in each one, the surface is revealed in a different way and a different history of like its traces and like latent material in them. But that's was sort of like, I guess, the conditions, as I described the definition of conditions at the beginning. I was interested in like setting up a set of conditions and then working those through. but not like a more poetic, deeper meaning. Yeah.
So earlier on, you were creating zines, and I guess we're talking about like looking for erotic imagery like out on these stances.
Mm-hmm.
And zines are like a way to, like distribute these publicly, which I'm assuming you were concerned with early on.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still feel, I guess, like a concern or a connection to this sort of like community-based image and like coming out with like niche things for queer people?
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess like has the transition to gallery and museum spaces been like, difficult or a concern for you?
Yeah, it's like, that's a good question. And it's, the thing that's come up differently has been, and this sort of makes itself apparent in the images with the double images of me and someone else, have highlighted that, at the beginning, we're all just sort of like in it. We're all like, we're all like 22 years old and just sort of like doing, or, some friends are older or whatever. But over time, there has become a stratification in terms of like different people's access to spaces, to exhibitions, to, let's say, the type of cultural capital. And that's one of the things that I was really interested in asking in terms of the project I did at the Whitney, where I was like, my work is so entangled with these people, with these close friends, these like, we're making work alongside each other. Like, my work cannot exist without their making of images as well, so I want to put those up ahead. Because also people started asking about like, when I mentioned like, oh, there's these other images that are being made, I was at a spot once and a collector was like, wait, but am I looking at the right one? Is this one yours? Is this one like, and I was like, oh, fuck this. Like, I'm just gonna do a show. I'm just gonna like try to come up with a show where I just show everyone else's work. So that's one way in which it's played out. So also with the zine stuff, like, that was actually a little bit probably more difficult because like the work was just getting out there and like becoming the subject of these other places that we didn't even anticipate at the time, right? And so also, this work was being made, and I don't think any of us would have ever imagined that like there'd be a show at the University of Houston and there'd be like a presentation, right? One of the things that I've made sure to do is, as much as I can, going back to, like, if I've lost touch with someone, like a couple of the people on the wall in there, Devin and who else did I have to, and Ben. I was like, hey, I just want to let you know, like, this work that, is going to be back up, so I'm trying to do that. One of the things that I've also done, because it's photography and because we're always working with multiples, is from the very beginning I always made a print for friends. So like all these friends, like if they wanted them, like have them as well. And at the zines I started making because I wanted to find a way to engage with like an audience and start a conversation that wasn't waiting for like a curator or someone to come along and try to, I had really bad experiences with like group shows right out of school, like going into debt for like doing things because some gallerist says you have to frame this thing and it needs to be this big, and I'm like, okay, like I guess I'll, and I was like, okay, wait, I can just scam the copier at my job, and when they ask me to go like photocopy things, I'm just gonna like sneak my things in, and then I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna sit and watch Law & Order and staple things, and I can give them away to friends, or I can sell them for $5. Like, it was a way of sort of taking agency, but at a certain point I found exclusively the zine world a little confining, because as soon as the work became less about like portraits of like cute young people, and me trying to ask different kinds of questions, like I found that I didn't have people to talk about that stuff with. So I kind of put that aside and rejected it for a while, and it took me some time to come back. But now, I really want to do like more zine stuff. I think making things accessible is super important. I made like poster projects for a few book fairs ago, and I want to get back into bookmaking. So yeah, it's all those things kind of come together in interesting ways. Did I get to that question? Yeah, okay. Good? Okay. Oh, ooh, there's two more. We can talk afterwards. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for sitting through all of that. And I apologize for the mic problems. What is, I don't know what it is.